talk is about making and working and the sort of labor that goes into artisan, local, and DIY production. Part of my talk is sort of, where does the drive to be a maker come from? So I've always been interested in creativity. I've worked as a journalist and a writer, exploring people's stories, and I also built this co-working community where members can pursue their projects. Many of us have been lucky enough to avoid the drudgery of real work, but real work is exactly what we do when we're pursuing our passions. But unfortunately, we're in some ways alienated from real work. And it's not surprising. So my presentation will talk a lot about the Industrial Revolution and how it was very obvious in terms of the squalid conditions of the industrial era and how easily people felt alienated and displaced through those. But we're also facing a lot of threats to our happiness as current makers as well in the modern era, from online platforms to large companies buying up craft producers. Many individuals stand to gain money by capitalizing on the maker movement. I'm outlining a few of the theories around production and consumption in this presentation that help us understand where maker culture comes from, and also a really broad overview of the history of small independent producers. They've often been exploited, but in some ways the tools of capitalism can be used to undo exploitation as well. So makers are ultimately gaining more freedom as they gain access to capital and tools and have access to a culture characterized by localization, individualization, and choice. But first, let's talk about how alienated we are from the current mass production labor. Okay, cool. Yeah, okay, great. This is sort of the depth of our alienation, basically. We take it as given now that the vast majority of our production happens overseas. It's out of mind and literally out of sight. So we only become aware of conditions of production when tragic incidents like the 2012 fire in Dhaka, Bangladesh, the clothing factory killed at least 117 people, many of them very young. Just last week, workers in Istanbul on contract to sew clothes for Zara sewed tags saying, "I made this item you were going to buy, but I didn't get paid for it." And the other one is degrading sweatshop conditions. So they were kind of getting their message out through like actual retail. To the end consumer. So we start to think about the people behind the production of our goods and how the goods we consume reflect ourselves and our values. This is something that we see this in the global south, but it's also something that was existent through the sort of history of industrialization. So I'm just going to go over some of the transition from home-based cottage production to industrial production, So we have kind of the idealistic top image where it's like the early 18th century in Britain, and industries are generally small scale, with most manufacturing done in homes or small rural shops using hand tools or simple machines. So this is the pre-industrial era. Most textile production, for example, was centered around small shops in the homes of spinners, weavers, and dyers. With the onset of the Industrial Revolution, steam engines, railways, and canals pushed cottage industries to the brink of extinction. Mass-produced goods were cheaper and faster produced. Meanwhile, working conditions in factories ranged from poor to horrific. Employers were held to no standards, and child labor was abundant. So that's like a factory from the industrial era. Industrial production, this might be obvious to a lot of people, but it's like it meant capitalists could afford to own machines, or were the only ones who could afford to own machines, like looms and mills, and they were easily able to surpass the efficiency of individuals and family farmers and producers. So. Mass-produced goods were cheap to produce, and they also had a lot of drawbacks. This is the consequence, right? So mass-produced products lacked specialization. So to produce goods at large volumes, they needed to lose some of the cultural specificity that they had in the pre-industrial era. So. For instance, in the early 17th century, all tartans were woven by hand and usually supplied locally. This kind of changed towards the end of the century with William Wilson's and Sons of Bannockburn. They were the first large-scale producer of tartan, even though the wearing of tartan was actually banned under the British rule at the time. They still mass-produced it. And then by the 1780s, Wilson's was using standard patterns and colors. So standardization was necessary to fill orders for large quantities of cloth and to ensure consistency in design and color from one order to the next. So generic goods are alienating because they don't represent our uniqueness. They're made for the masses. And then there's also kind of like a difference there's a corollary as well in terms of non-mass and non-generic goods at the time, and actually really throughout the history. But we can actually focus sort of more on Renaissance and earlier. So in the Renaissance, customized and individually suited goods were made for the upper classes. And fashion, basically tailoring sort of became a thing in that era, featuring sort of a tighter fit, like a more a fit that followed the contours of the body, and this kind of changed the way bodies were perceived and also how clothing was perceived, so that they were desirable goods, and the bodies themselves were sort of given desirability and status that comes along with it. So mass production opened a world of consumption to many classes that never would have had access before, but it also gave sort of unique status to people who could have more unique goods, and that was sort of a way to like retain their power. So let's just dive deeper into the conflation of objects, identity, and value. So this is a quote from Marx. So this sort of section is about Marx and commodity fetishism. So it's basically like the status that objects give us is based on the labor that produces the commodity. So if you think of like an actual real-world example, like the value of a commodity isn't just simply like the object or a product with some intrinsic level of utility or use value. It's like if that were the case, there wouldn't be like $3,000 handbags and $30,000 Rolex watches, because like a Prada bag doesn't carry things better, and a Rolex watch doesn't tell time better. Certain objects have cultural value beyond their intrinsic value. So this gets at the idea that we're consuming not just for utility, but also items have cultural significance. So in his essay, in Marx's essay, The Fetishism of Commodities and the Secret Thereof, Marx states that the mystical character of commodities does not originate in their use value. It's the peculiar social character of the labor that produces the commodities. This could take the form of an extravagantly produced work of art by a brilliant mind of the era, but it could also be like a painting, created by a dear friend, and it could also mean consuming things that are really rare and costly. So that kind of brings me to the next theorist that I want to talk about, which is Veblen, and he sort of extended Marx's theory a bit into the into the area of social into the social prestige of goods. He proposed that conspicuous consumption of commodities was an act done in the pursuit of social prestige. And he wrote about this in his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, published in 1899. And in the book, it describes how industry required men to be diligent, efficient, and cooperative, while those who ruled the business world were concerned with making money and displaying their wealth. Pretty obvious to us right now, but at the time it was, I guess, pretty shocking. So their outlook, he wrote, was he sort of wrote elaborately about the sort of garish displays of wealth that he was seeing at the time, that the ruling classes were sort of conspicuously consuming. And this was not just goods, but it was amusements, fashion, sports, religion, and aesthetic tastes. Rather than buy things that were necessary, Veblen conceived of a consumption that goods and services were valuable for their own sake. So in his era, this might have been like elaborately carved ivory sculptures, but in our era, we have things like the I Am Rich app. If you remember that, it was an iOS app that showed a red ruby and cost $999. It had no real purpose other than showing that the owner was able to purchase it. And you think like no one is going to purchase this, right? But it's like 8 of these apps were purchased like within the first few days. So that's like an app idea for you guys. So I mean, it's an outlandish purpose, but it kind of like proves that there's a sort of the consumption of goods reaffirms our sense of self, especially in a world where products are more homogeneous, and the homogeneity sort of began with the onset of mass production. So the other thing is kind of in terms of like applying values to products. I'm not sure if this will actually work, but this is, oh yeah, great. So this is the Think Different ad by Apple. And just watch for the... Okay. So just watch for familiar faces. So if you couldn't hear the audio, it was sort of a narrator waxing poetic about, being sort of a unique soul and thinking different, and everyone thinking that you're sort of like the odd one out, and all of this stuff, and it sort of imposed onto this footage of like John Lennon, Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Albert Einstein, like all of these people. So like when you're buying an Apple product, apparently this is the sort of like lineage that you're sort of buying into. So you're a different thinker. It reaffirms your identity as someone who thinks different, just like Dr. King, Gandhi, and Einstein. So through this differentiation, we can explain the sort of psychological mechanics of a consumer society where there's an increasing number and variety of goods. Since most of us aren't independently wealthy aristocrats, there's also like the consumption of goods, which is like an important part of this as well. So, can I get to the next slide? Okay, great. So this is a really interesting part, I think. This is Max Weber and the righteousness of work. So in his 1905 book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber describes the Western societal change starting around the time of the Protestant Reformation. And it's not very intuitive now, but in that era, Catholics in the Middle Ages found it difficult to reconcile individual free will and the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent God. So how could people have control over their actions and their lives when God was so powerful? Like it's a bit of a conundrum. So the Protestant Reformation challenged religious doctrine through allowing parishioners to read the Bible through translations. And it allowed them to question. It sort of opened up a lot of new thought. Oh, 5. Okay. So Weber observed that dedication to worldly activities could take on a religious significance after the Protestant Reformation. So it was permissible to have a calling and to work and to do work as an expression of devotion to God. So the Protestant work ethic identified by Weber implied a certain piety in work. And I just want to like mention that he has a really great quote in the Protestant work ethic where he's talking about leisure pursuits, and he says, loss of time through sociability, idle talk, luxury, even more sleep than is necessary for health, 6 to at most 8 hours is worthy of absolute moral condemnation. So like he hated slackers so much. It kind of reads like satire, but it's also, it illustrates a lot of our psychology around work, I think. Even centuries after, we have an obsession with the goodness of work, defining ourselves through our work ethic, and we kind of derive some of our free will from our actions through work. And the idea of a calling is very, very relevant to our daily life. This is kind of leads into more of so I'll just like skip forward a little bit to our kind of our making in a post-industrial world. I think that industrialization, to just kind of summarize, industrialization was about sort of producing more goods more quickly than small producers. And during the 20th century, there was an emergence. This sort of logic was sort of expanded to a wide scale, and we had lots of multinational corporations, operating under the same principles, but instead of sort of finding like cheap labor in like West London, they'd find cheap labor in Southeast Asia. So mass production went to the global South. And then there was an emerging managerial class in the global north, sort of orchestrating everything and becoming extremely wealthy. So in the 90s, there was Uh, So in the 90s, like at the beginning of the 90s, in 1990, 1 in 3 workers was white collar. So a lot of people sort of came from a blue collar family, but then they sort of through education and other means. They'd managed to enter a growing middle class of cultural and information-based professionals. So when we look at DIY culture of the 90s, it's kind of played out in popular media, like in Home Improvement and Martha Stewart and like Bob Vila, shows like that. There were lots of like people who were kind of identifiable as like maybe white collar people, but they were also like doing a lot of things and crafts and fixing things. So. Obviously, a lot of the stuff is also very gendered, so take it with a grain of salt. And I think there are a lot of different things going on there. But I just to take Home Improvement as an example. It showed like Tim the Toolman Taylor. He was like a stereotypical guy, and he he loved tools, but instead of being like a working class worker, he was a TV show host, which is like a really white collar job. And instead of being a skilled professional, he's kind of like this bumbling, talentless poser. So it kind of was a bit like of a satire of the masculine world of power tools and DIY. But it also kind of spoke to a lot of people who felt disconnected from like actual production and making of things. In some ways, like it could also be read as a return to traditional gender norms, which isn't great. But it also had like a few things. Well, I mean, he kind of like learned these new age masculinity lessons from his neighbor Wilson. Aside from that, it's like he kind of showed that like we can use production to navigate our relationships in post-industrial capitalism. If only in our spare time, right? Here are like these middle class people, that are choosing to make goods themselves, and it's on TV, and it's sort of like something that a lot of us grew up with. I'm just gonna like kind of go through some of this stuff kind of quickly. So I just want to like reiterate that. Oh yeah. Okay, so there's an appeal of like the artisan. I sort of like, if we think about Marx and Weber, that man-made goods have social significance beyond their utility, and that creators of these goods are driven by motives beyond profit. Those are the sort of like central tenets. And making goods and buying artisan goods satisfies their need to express ourselves through objects. And it gives us a sense of place and connection. So I want to go through like 3 quick examples of sort of maybe some of the issues and the challenges that's happening like right now in the maker movement. So this is if you guys use Etsy, this is kind of an interesting shop. One of the things they're selling is a baguette shelf with blueberries, I think, strung down. So it's kind of a unique thing. But Etsy is kind of interesting because it's a platform that lets people, it kind of like consolidates all of the makers onto this one platform. So you don't have to build your own website. You don't have to like handle your own payments. But at the same time, Etsy controls that network, and if they change rules, if you see like YouTube sort of changed their rules a little while ago for creators, so it's like Etsy could do a similar thing because they're a private company and they don't have any sort of accountability. So they could change their rules, but for the most part, they are kind of good in terms of a network capitalism. Another thing, Starbucks. So this was actually inspired by Italian coffee chains. The CEO, Howard Schultz, wanted to sort of recreate the idea of these sort of very like nice artisan coffee shops that you saw in Italy, but then kind of systemizing something and taking the local global sort of takes a lot of the essence out of it. So it's kind of pretty inauthentic by the time it gets to North America. And the last one, this is a really quick one. It's kind of like Anheuser-Busch InBev is the world's largest brewing company, and they've been buying up all of these craft breweries and kind of like putting them under their they call it their high-end portfolio. So you could think you're buying like a locally produced craft brewery or brew, and they're actually owned by a huge multinational. So that's basically it. I mean, understanding, just like a quick thought, sort of like understanding the history of the labor movement and like how we as makers fit into that is really important because we kind of like can bring it back to the global south where most of the manufacturing is happening. And I think that if we're fighting for rights for all workers, we have to like think about those workers as well and their conditions and fair wages and that we can also sort of make our own destiny because we're makers. And that's it.